Okay, just about there. Okay, and we're live. Hello, everybody. Patchwai. We're going to give you a second to join in for our live stream for War Cry podcast. Okay. So our intent today is to learn how our guest helps families tell their stories about missing and murdered Indigenous women and people. This also includes, being an advocate and telling advocate stories. Our guest today hosts podcasts on the topic and is internationally known journalist. This topic can be sensitive and triggering, and we urge you to take self-care when needed. If you need to step away during the podcast, we completely understand that part of it. Again, welcome to this episode of War Cry Podcast. We are in season 2. We are an all native run podcast discussing data, events, stories, issues, and historical connections about Northwest missing and murdered natives. We are located on the Yakima Reservation. Thank you for joining us for this episode. We are live streaming during the noon hour Pacific time. We will be checking, by we, I mean my producer, will be checking for comments or insights. My name is Emily Washings, and co-hosts today are Patsy Whitefoot, Robin Peebushy, and Lucy Smartlowit. Our guest today is Connie Walker, host of Stolen: The Search for Jermaine by Gimlet Media, which you can find on Spotify. Before we have our guests introduce themselves, we want to have a few announcements. Are we going to go with Parker Doe first? Okay, yes. The first announcement is about Parker Doe, which, as you recall from our episode with Tammy Ayer, this was a woman that was found on the Yakima Reservation on February 16th, 1988. It has been 33 years, and this woman is still unidentified. This week, the coroner's office released a digital image and, to try to help get information and find her family and answer the questions surrounding her homicide. So Robin has up on the screen right now the clay skeleton that was done at a university, and then they did a digital reconstruction. Okay. Robin, do you have other announcements? Oh, yes. Let me bring it up. So again, just wanting to share again, we are going through wildfires here in the Pacific Northwest, especially here on the Yakima Reservation. And this is just an example. This is from this morning. This is the gap, as we call. We've talked about it a few times about on this side, left side, being the reservation, and then this right side kind of being the divide here. But these are two hills. It just shows, prayers to people who, are suffering respiratory issues or anything like that. It is a hazardous time for air quality right now.
Yeah, it also is increasing a lot of testing and anticipatory stress regarding, symptoms being matched.
Yes.
And, just to remind our viewers, our style of this podcast is, we all love to drink our coffee and we all love to go to different places along the reservation to eat it. And so we really like to have this I'm drinking coffee style of podcast. There's Robin with her drink, Connie with hers, and really like you're just sitting at the table next to us listening. So it's, it can be a lot more informal than some of the others. And with that, I want to, I know I said you're internationally known, award-winning journalist, but I want to really hear, Connie, from you and how you would like to introduce yourselves to our viewers.
Sure. I just wanted to say that I'm so happy to be here today with you all and joining you. I'm currently in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, but I'm originally from Saskatchewan, from the Okanese First Nation, which is where I grew up in File Hills, which is a community there. And yeah, I'm thrilled to join you, and I just admire the work that you're doing. Telling your own stories and lifting up our voices. So thank you all for having me, and I hope you guys are doing okay out there. That like those wildfires are no joke. How are you guys doing?
It's
I'm okay.
not fun, especially if you have asthma and those kinds of things. And I'm at the foothills of the mountains here, and it just rolls off from the mountains. Yeah, so that's the reason that I asked earlier how everyone was doing.
Yeah. Terrible.
I also want to from our community consultant, also a co-host, Patsy. She has us go in alphabetical order. So for our first question, we're going to turn to Robin, our youngest of our group.
Alphabetical order and or oldest or youngest to oldest.
Oh, sorry, yeah. I don't know why I said alphabetical. The smoke is affecting me, everybody.
Yeah.
It's picking up alphabetical and youngest to oldest.
Let's see. So as all of us have our different journeys into how we got into the work that we're doing now, how did you get into your profession that you're doing now? How did you get into doing like podcasting and investigative journalism?
I've been a reporter for about 20 years, and I think that my interest in journalism first started actually when I was in high school. I grew up like on a very small reserve outside of a very small town in rural Saskatchewan. And if you guys aren't familiar with Saskatchewan, I'd say it's probably really similar to Montana or South Dakota, very close in proximity as well. So, I think that when I was, growing up in Saskatchewan, the first time I thought about becoming a journalist, or the first time I actually wrote something for our school paper, was when a woman named Pamela George was killed in Regina, Saskatchewan. And I didn't know Pamela George, but she was from a reserve not far from mine. And I wasn't even, I think, a teenager who paid much attention to the news, really. But I think everybody in Saskatchewan, especially every First Nations or Indigenous woman, knew about Pamela George. She was a mother, a young mom, and she was a sister and an auntie and a daughter, and she was killed. And I remember so much of the media attention was focused on the two men who were charged in Pamela's death, and I remember feeling like we knew more about them than we knew about Pamela. That one of them was a basketball player, the other one played hockey. Like they were from this, middle-class families in Regina, and I remember the way that the media talked about Pamela, and it really, made me really upset as a young Indigenous woman. And I thought about, the people who were writing the stories, and I wondered, or I imagined that there weren't any Indigenous people who were working in those spaces, and so I wrote something for like my high school paper after those two men ended up being acquitted of Pamela's murder and sentenced to manslaughter in her death. I think that I probably didn't have the words for it at the time, but I think that the way that she was talked about, felt, so upsetting in terms of what it said about how the justice system treated Indigenous women and girls, and violence committed against us, and also, the media's portrayal of Pamela and what happened, and also what that said about how we were valued or not valued in society. But it was a really, really long time. Like, I think I started as an intern at CBC in 2000. And for most of, most of my career there at CBC, there was very little interest in hearing stories about us and from our communities, unless there was something, some terrible crisis or conflict had happened. And so So it really has only been, I would say, in the last, 8 to 10 years that has started to change, and that shift has been happening. And before that, it was really a difficult thing to be one of a few journalists at the CBC. Like, we're still very underrepresented in media, and that's changing, and there's a lot of amazing young Indigenous journalists who are coming up and leading the charge. But it's really been, I think, slow progress. We need to move faster. So that was a really long answer to your question. I'm sorry.
You have a response, Robin?
Good. No, it was really good. It's interesting because that's kind of how we got started here as well. It's just seeing like the different cases going on, and we're just kind of just approaching things the way that we can. And so thank you.
Yeah, and I appreciate you sharing that aspect of your youth advocacy, as well as the process of not understanding some things. I actually wanted to share an article about from August 8, 2019, written by Lillian Upman and Charcusta News. And the reason why I want to share this is, living in rural areas, we always wonder, like, why are they talking about that? Why are they bringing this up? I think, you coming from a very rural area, us living in a rural area, people know each other. We wonder why we're talking about certain things. And it was actually a young gentleman in this young team that I first heard about Jermaine's case. Mm-hmm. And I just want to take a second to share how this is connected to the Yakima people. Our podcast is focused on Northwest missing and murdered, but here we have a young gentleman that is of Yakima descent that was going to play basketball, and he wanted to bring her name forward and have a handprint on his mouth to help bring advocacy. And he asked his team if they'd be willing to do the same. And Belinda, who is the aunt of the Jermaine Charlo, painted the boys' faces and explained the symbolism of the handprint across the mouth meant no more silence about our women missing and speaking out on awareness. And when I think about, youth advocacy, I also think about elder advocacy. I think about, the latest episode that you had, which was, also on August 8th, but years later. I'm somebody that finds symbolism in dates and timing and meaning, and it just seems like, let's get some answers. And I just wonder if you can explore and talk about, that latest development in Jermaine's case, as well as, how much her grandmother is an advocate.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack in there. I think that, so for the last few years, I've been focused pretty exclusively on reporting on violence against Indigenous women and girls. And because the podcast that I do focuses typically on like one case, one individual, one woman or one girl per season, who is missing or murdered, it really becomes her family who are the people who are telling or helping to tell her story, and the people who are being the advocates and who are taking that on. And there are, it's so heartbreaking to think of, how many families have been in this position where they're not only dealing with the grief and loss of losing a loved one or not knowing where they are, or having them, go missing, but then they have to then, because, I've heard from so many families that, they have trouble, getting police interested in their loved one's disappearance, or ask, that these stories have been largely ignored in media, really, until very recently. And so feeling like they don't have anywhere to turn, and feeling like they have to be their loved one's biggest advocate. And I think that was absolutely true for Jermaine's family, and especially her yaya, Vicky Morgeau. So in the podcast, The Search for Jermaine, we try to really dive deeply into Germain's unsolved disappearance. So she was last seen in 2018. She was in downtown Missoula, which I'm sure you guys are familiar, but is a really vibrant, small, but vibrant college town. And she was out, and she was last seen leaving a bar in downtown Missoula on a Friday night in early summer in June 15th. But actually it was after midnight, so it was early morning, June 16th. And she was captured on surveillance footage leaving this bar. And she turned a corner, and that was the last confirmed sighting of Germain Charlot. And her grandmother, Vicky, I was able to meet her and her aunts, Valinda and Danny, who have become, Germain's biggest advocates and who have been so dedicated to raising awareness about Germain's case, but also I think what is so incredible about them and the work they're doing is that they're also advocating for this issue for other families and trying to make sure that what they have experienced and what has happened to them is not the same thing that other families have to go through. And her grandmother Vicky, Germain's grandma Vicky was immediately concerned. Like the day after, she didn't hear from Germain, she was like, this is unlike her. This is somebody, she always texts me back or calls me back. She's very active on social media. And as soon as she wasn't, Vicky was concerned right away and started mobilizing her kids. And she wasn't home at the time. She was out of state. So it was also hard for her to be doing that work from so far away, but she headed home, and her aunt Belinda tried to get her reported missing. I'm sure you guys, I think in particular, know this maybe better than anyone else, but there are so many jurisdictional issues that impact how law enforcement deals with these kinds of cases, but also which law enforcement do you call? Sometimes it's really different depending on where you are on the reservation. And Germain's reservation, I think there are 5 different counties that have jurisdiction on there, but she went missing in Missoula. So her family approached the tribal police. They approached also the Missoula City Police Department. And so our podcast, is really kind of a deep dive into the mystery of Germain's disappearance and really helping to try to shed light on the police investigation and what happened in the early days and weeks and months of her disappearance. But we also take, I think, an equally in-depth look at Germain's life leading up to her disappearance. I think that for me as an Indigenous woman, I think I'm so encouraged now that there is more coverage and more awareness about the violence that we face. But I think that along with that, we really need to take a deeper look, that it can't only be focused on, the violence that results in someone's death or disappearance, that we really need to look at the systemic issues at the heart of it. And you had asked earlier, Robin, about how I got into podcasting. It was I never expected to end up where I am. But for a long time, there was no interest in stories from our communities. And then that started to change, and I started doing more reporting. And I was mostly a TV reporter for a really long time. And I was, when I was reporting on cases about missing or murdered Indigenous women and girls, I remember almost from the beginning feeling a kind of frustration that so much of their story, was really difficult to include in 2-minute news stories or even 15-minute news stories. That, I remember reporting on an unsolved murder in northern Manitoba of a 15-year-old girl named Leah Anderson. And we spent 5 days in her community and got to do interviews with her family and friends and really tried to understand the circumstances around her disappearance. But just being in the community and meeting her family, I realized there were so many pieces of context that were so relevant to her story, and I think relevant to even her unsolved murder, that we didn't get to include in a 15-minute documentary for TV. We didn't get to talk about the fact that she was involved in the child welfare system, and that was such a big issue in that community, and the fact that her father had had died a violent death, and this kind of trauma that's associated with that and how it is impacting our families and communities. We didn't get to talk about the legacies of residential schools and boarding schools in that family, and I know that those are absolutely things that impact violence against Indigenous women and girls. We didn't get to talk about the fact that they didn't have equal access to like clean drinking water or proper sewage services, that there was a housing crisis in the community. There's all this like important context that I think is really important to understanding these issues that we weren't able to include. And so when I first had the opportunity to work on a podcast where we dive really deeply into one story and one case over 8, 9, 10 episodes, and in totality like hours of audio focused on one story, I felt like this was the way that we could provide all of that context. This is the format that we can use to help people really understand the truth, and because there's so much that we have to educate and inform people about our lives, because there's so much that people don't understand about contemporary Indigenous life. A lot of people feel like we live in the past, or our stories are just starting to kind of get the representation that they deserve, but that means that we have a lot of catching up to do, and there's a lot of education, and so I found podcasting to be a really important part of that. And so in getting to look at Germain's unsolved case, it was also really important for us to feel like we're allowing people to get to know her family in the way that I was so lucky to get to know them in the time that I spent with them. And this is a family that like I said has been just had to become these incredible advocates for their granddaughter and niece and sister, but who also are desperate to find her and to bring Germain home. And so the update episode that we did a couple of weeks ago was a kind of a continuation of the investigation that we did. So, there was an arrest made, and so our update episode talked about it, the arrest. It wasn't in relation to Germain's disappearance. It was Germain's ex-boyfriend, who has never been charged or even named a suspect in her disappearance. I want to make sure I'm clear about that. But we know that he was a large kind of focus of the police investigation following her disappearance. And we talk about a lot about that in our podcast. And he was arrested by the detective who's actually been the lead investigator in Germain's disappearance, but he was arrested on a firearms charge. And so our episode is trying to kind of unpack all of that and show how it's related, to Germain, but not necessarily to her disappearance. And you guys would probably understand this better than I would, but in the United States, he was charged with this firearms offense because they said, according to the prosecutor, that he was not supposed to have firearms because he had a prior conviction of domestic violence. And in our reporting, we talk a lot about that prior conviction of domestic violence, because we were able to get the documents that show he had been arrested and pled guilty to assaulting Germain when she was still a minor, when she was 17. And so we did a lot of that reporting, and we talk again to Germain's family and her aunt Danny and her grandmother Vicky, and give an update on how they're doing, and that's what our update episode is about. But yeah, her family have just been incredible advocates for her.
Yeah, thank you so much for kind of explaining the development in the case, as well as the family and community positioning of being an advocate. I think and again, like different contexts that Connie brings into her reporting are for our audience. If you're not aware, and if you haven't listened to any of her podcasts, you can really see and hear, actually for podcast, you'd hear it. You can really hear those different levels and layers being brought out. And I think has stayed with me since I listened to the latest episode of Stolen is we're talking about the multi-jurisdictional issues that the family is facing, the unanswered questions, them lined up outside the courtroom, the grandmother in cancer treatment with a cane, and you had said it's almost like a very slow chess game in which there's a piece moved after years. And you said, but to the family, it's not a game. And that just encapsulated a lot for a lot of different cases. And I just appreciate you continuing to bring that context in for families and our missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. I'm going to turn it over to Lucy for her question.
So thank you, Connie, for being on the show, for one. This is really exciting. And also explaining the process of why you wanted to do individual cases for your podcast, and what the context is leading up to the situation, and then the aftermath of it, and what continues to happen after. Given that I imagine you would have to spend a lot of time to build relationships with those families. So with that being said, how did you go about to building those relationships? And then do you continue to keep in touch with those families, or do they continue to reach out to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think that when we're talking about telling stories about our communities and from our communities, and talking with people, and asking them to share their stories, I always feel like we really also need to be really aware of the history of how our stories have been told, and largely it's been non-Indigenous people for a long time coming in to our communities and telling our stories and leaving, and because they're not from our communities and they don't have this lived experience that we have, that I think that then they don't include a lot of that context, or they don't understand the importance of it, or they're not able to connect the dots in the way that I think we are. And so I was quite, I was concerned about reporting on this issue in the United States, because I'm from Canada. I'm from Saskatchewan, but I've spent a lot of time reporting in Canada, so I feel like maybe a little bit more comfortable and familiar with the issues in our communities. And so when I came to the U.S., I was really aware of how, I know there are lots of similarities, but there are clearly a lot of differences, and I wanted to be sensitive to that. And I think that, at the beginning, I feel like I approached those kinds of things with very little expectations. I'm obviously, so, like, as I mentioned, because so much of this work is really dependent on the families who are the people who become the advocates and really help share the story of their loved one who's missing or murdered. And that's a really difficult thing, and I've now had the experience of reporting on this issue for a number of years, and speaking with a lot of different families. And I think that, every family is in a different place, and it really is dependent on so many things, how they feel about speaking with media or talking to a reporter, even if I'm an Indigenous reporter. I think that I imagine that makes it easier, because I think that it informs my approach. I definitely am not, I try to be really sensitive to the trauma that I know that they are experiencing. And as somebody who's been impacted by trauma in my own life, I think I really try to approach families with a lot of care and empathy, and have, like I said, very, very, I don't have a ton of expectations for them, or I don't apply a lot of pressure. I really feel like if this is something that you feel that you want to do, or is worthwhile for you, then great. and so with Jermaine's family, you know, I didn't even know if I was going to get to meet her grandmother really when I went there, and I like, you know, that, you know, I think I spent 3 weeks in Montana on that first trip, and that was very much like, you know, getting to spend, you know, I had a number of visits in those 3 weeks with Jermaine's family and chances to talk to them. But then, like I said, that was just the beginning. Like, you know, I think I was there in June, and then the podcast didn't come out until March. And so there were so many conversations in between that, and still, like, you know, I've been in touch with some of Jermaine's family this week even, you know, so we definitely do keep in touch. But yeah, these are, you know, this is I think this for me is more than a job. You know, I feel like this is I feel like a responsibility to help tell these stories in a way that is respectful. And for families who are going through it, you know, it's obviously, this is their real life. And I, you know, this is, I try to be as sensitive as I can be, but it really, I know it's really difficult for them. And then for other podcasts, like I'm definitely still in touch with, you know, Johnny and Crystal from the Finding Cleo podcast, but as you know, as those, you know, we're not in touch as often as we were obviously when it was happening. But yeah, I definitely try to maintain relationships as much as I can.
I was wondering about that, if you have been in touch with the brother that was living in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
I thought his story from Finding Cleo was really, it like when we heard that there are 2 Yakima boys there, me and my sisters were like, what in the heck, you know, like,
Yeah.
because I know that we're live, but that was a censored version of our reactions. But I just was really curious because it sounded like at the beginning, you know, of the relationship, he was a little apprehensive to engage with you. And I was just even really taken aback by, you know, his the way that he thought about assimilation and becoming fully assimilated. That really struck me in a different way. And I just, you know, was trying to imagine what my response would be in that situation and talking to somebody. And I don't know if I would have been heartbroken, you know, and trying to convince them otherwise, or if it would have been, you know, a different type of reaction. And so I imagine in your situation, you have to learn how to be the one that listens, but also the one that doesn't pass judgment with, you know, your body language or your, you know, your face or anything, or even tones. And so I feel like that just gets really tricky at times, you know, because you'd never know what's going to trigger you in that process either. But,
yeah, Johnny, I mean, I feel like yeah, like with Johnny, for sure, I think that one thing that I feel like I've realized in my reporting is that even with things like big things like this that happen, like I think I would imagine that, like, oh, they must have, you know, as a family talked about this a lot and hashed out all of these things. And then when you know, I come in as like this independent person and I ask these questions and with Johnny, you know, especially about, you know, his past and his experience, you know, I think that he shared, like, sometimes that was the first time that he would have talked about that, you know, and that is such a, I think it can, I was really sensitive to it, and I imagine that would be really hard. And I remember when we were talking about that podcast in particular, and like, and what kinds of, you know, promotion for the podcast we should do and how we should engage with people on social media. And there was an idea at the time that we should create this Facebook group so that people can come and talk about the podcast, and that people like to follow along episode by episode. And I was really concerned about that because I felt like that was treating it too much like a story, like that it was like, people consuming something and then talking about their theories in this Facebook group. And that I thought maybe, for Johnny and Crystal, Cleo's sister, Crystal Smeganis, who's called Christine in the podcast, but she's since reclaimed her birth name and goes by Crystal. I remember thinking for them that could be a really difficult thing to like go on Facebook and see people talking about your life. And I was trying to be really sensitive to that, and so we decided not to do that. But then I remember when it came out, like I think like seeing them both really engage with people, and actually like they were so active on Facebook and so active on Twitter and connecting with people, and they still are. Like Johnny sent me something the other day where he's been asked to speak at a school, to talk about the podcast and to talk about his family story, and I'm just in awe that they are so able to do that, and be so engaged and be okay with wanting to keep talking about it and be as open as they have been. It's amazing, and I'm so glad to have been able to be there and have those conversations, but also just it's so great to watch. I'm not involved in that anymore, but they're still doing it, which is so great.
Finding Cleo is also another podcast that you can tune into. I do want to say hello to those of our audience that are tuning in live. We have almost a dozen people, so hello to you. Please leave your comments or questions in the chat, and our producer will make sure to let us know. And up on the screen, we have Missing and Murdered, Finding Cleo, with different episodes. And I'm going to turn it over to Patsy for her question.
Yes, Connie, you've answered some of this, but I was wanting to hear from you about some key principles that you have that you think is important for non-native reporters to consider and employ in their reporting about Native, missing and murdered Indigenous peoples.
Thanks for that. I mean, it's there are actually so many, I feel like, great resources out there for non-Indigenous people who are interested in reporting in Indigenous communities. The one I always mention is a guide called Reporting in Indigenous Communities, and you can find it at riic.ca. It's not specific to MMIW necessarily, or MMIP, but I think it's meant to be kind of a guide for non-Indigenous journalists who are interested in telling stories from our communities. And I mean, I think that an understanding and a recognition of how these stories have been portrayed in the media and how harmful that has been. I think that there are lots of reasons why I think our stories were so underrepresented in media, but then often even misrepresented. And I think that journalists really need to take a hard look in the mirror and see really clearly the impacts of that. I think that there are so many stereotypes that exist about Indigenous people that are sometimes reinforced by those kinds of stories, and I think that people need to be aware of that. The other thing I think is that it's so important, I think, in reporting on any violence, but specifically within Indigenous communities, to understand the impacts of trauma and an understanding of how just the role of trauma in Indigenous communities. For every story that I've reported on. I think, like, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that whatever it is, I'm there to talk about, if it's the loss of a loved one or someone's disappearance, that it's not the only trauma that person has gone through, that it's interwoven in our lives. And it also, it didn't just happen, that this is actually connected back to a bigger part of our shared history that a lot of us don't understand. And it's connected back to the child welfare policies that led to things like the 60 scoop. It's connected back to residential schools, which was, in Canada was something that children were sent to residential schools for generations. They were in operation for over 100 years in Canada. And we need to understand, like, how, even though we see these black and white images of residential schools, the reality is they're not that old. The last school closed when I was still in high school. My father's went to a residential school. All of his 15 or 14 siblings all went to residential schools. My both of his parents went. My grandparents went, and these are things that are continuing to impact our communities. And I think that we journalists need to understand that history and try to learn about it, and try to learn about the way that our stories have been portrayed in media and how the impacts that's had on, like, not just us, but our relationship with media, and our relationship, like, whether or not people are interested in talking or will trust media. Like, I feel like those are things that we really need to be aware of. And I think that another thing is trying to have an understanding of the diversity that exists in our communities, that there is not one single Indigenous experience across North America, that there's so many diverse nations. In Canada, First Nations, Inuit, Métis. In the United States, it's equally, diverse, and that we really need to try to learn as much as we can about the individual communities that we're going into. And I think I don't think that's rocket science for journalists. We're often put in those situations where we have to, and we're in a really great position to do that work and to ask questions. And if you don't know, it's one of the things I love about my job, is that I don't know something and I get to ask people who do know, and I get to ask them questions, and I get to hear their stories, and I get to learn. And so I think that absolutely we have a responsibility as journalists to do that work, and to be aware of those things before taking on these really incredibly sensitive stories. And I think the other thing is, like, not to feel entitled. Like, people do not have to share. They should not feel compelled to share. And we need to, like, be examining kind of the power structures that exist in journalism, and being aware of that when we're especially when you're reporting on communities that have been underrepresented or marginalized, I think.
I really appreciate you sharing, about where you see non-Native reporting as well. I think all of these that you share with us is important in terms of highlighting, what non-Native journalists need to take into consideration. And I would agree with you. I'm curious, what is the name of that guide again?
It's called Reporting in Indigenous Communities, and it's at riic.ca, and it was created by my former colleague and friend Duncan McHugh, and he's an incredible Indigenous journalist here in Canada. The other thing I feel like is a really big point, and I should say, is that I think that what Indigenous journalists, non-Indigenous journalists, need to do is to support Indigenous journalists to tell our own stories. That we are the ones who should be helping to share stories from our communities, that we're in the best position because of our lived experiences as Indigenous people to connect those dots in a meaningful way and to understand, and that we are the ones who are also underrepresented in media. So they need to be taking a look around in their newsrooms and thinking about, what am I doing to help support Indigenous journalists to take on these stories? What am I doing to make sure that I'm helping to create a safe space for Indigenous people in these newsrooms where we've been so underrepresented, and also, once we get there, there's a huge problem in terms of keeping us there and supporting us and retaining it. There are so many talented Indigenous journalists who unfortunately have left journalism because of it's not enough to just have people in those spaces. We need to make sure that we're ensuring they're safe spaces for us, and that we are supported in doing this important work.
I just have one final question. So how do you think the journalism community has responded to Native reporters? I mean, do you get asked to talk about that with non-Native audiences? I would think that something in your role, particularly at the national, international level, would be asked to speak about some of these issues to non-Native reporters.
Yeah, I think it's such a complex thing. Like, yeah, absolutely. And I want to do my part to try to raise awareness about some of those issues. And I know that there are a lot of really, really well-intentioned and people who are invested in helping make those changes, and they want to do the work to understand everything that they don't know and to try to create safe spaces. So I try to engage in those conversations as much as I can. I think it's shifted a lot. I often tell this story, but when I was an intern, my very first job in a mainstream newsroom, I was, I think I had a job there for 4 months. So I was an intern, and my job was chase producing for a national morning show. And so I was finding guests and then, arranging for them to come on the show to talk about whatever topic was in the news that day. And when I was an intern, there was a fisheries dispute happening on the east coast of Canada, where Indigenous fishermen were fishing, and there were conflicts with non-Native fishermen who and that's still ongoing in some ways. But when I was an intern, I had booked a local chief to come on the show to talk about the latest development. And my senior producer at the time was like, did you tell him what time it was? Because it was a morning show and it was really early in the morning, and where to go. And I said, yes. And this was on a Friday, and he was due to come on the show on the Monday. And she said, because those Indians, they'll go out drinking all weekend and they won't show up on a Monday morning. And I looked around. I remember looking around to see if anyone else heard her say that. And everyone else was, busy, on their phones or at their desks, and no one paid any attention. But I think that sent a really clear signal to me about the kind of space that I was in, and who, I was an intern and she was a senior producer, and I didn't feel like I could say anything, and I didn't say anything. And I didn't I have had other experiences similar to that, where I've encountered racism at work since then. But I think that a lot has changed since then. I feel like there is an awareness and an understanding, and I think that we still need to do more. There still needs to be so much more done. And I think that for me, it's also a question about who are we doing this work for? And that's why I think what you are all doing is so amazing, because it feels like you're all Indigenous led, you have an all Indigenous team that you're working with, and you're telling stories for your community. And I've always been in mainstream spaces where, for a long time I worked at the CBC, which is a public broadcaster in Canada. And so our mandate was to serve Canadians, which of course include Indigenous people in Canada, but are not exclusive to it. And even the reporting that we were doing, it felt like, it's educating non-Indigenous people about us, and so it feels like it's kind of for them. And so I've been thinking about like the reporting that we're doing, like how can it be for us as well as you know. I think it's important. I think it's an important role that journalists have to help educate and inform. But I also have been thinking about, you know, how it's, you know, I want to be there for as a support and help make change. But also I want to be doing this for us, and I want this to have positive impacts in our communities, and thinking about ways to do that is really important too.
Thank you so much for sharing your story and your experiences. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And speaking about teams, I want to turn it to Robin just to go back on a policy that you had mentioned in Canada. And I'm turning this to Robin specifically because her mother and her has listened to Finding Cleo.
You're totally right on point. I was just going to tell you, Connie, that the Finding Cleo story was really touching to me and my mother. I had her listen to it with me. And so it was for many reasons. And Lucy had brought up one of the first reasons why I was like, hey, Mom, we should listen to this, because you talked about Cleo's brother being on a farm, essentially, where people were just like adopting children to work essentially for free, you know, free labor.
Mm-hmm.
And with whatever other benefits came with that, but also the fact that he had seen Yakimas there, 2 Yakima boys, and they talked about them running away, or about, you know, and of course the first thing going through your mind, well, which family was that? You know, which one was it? Because, you know, we tend to know the families, like, and so my mom was always like, oh, I wonder if it was this family or this family who had kids, you know, and or if she was trying to remember if she'd heard any stories like that. So already it had just like got into our consciousness about like how, you know, we all had interacted in these like weird spaces that, you know, unfortunately is where we had to interact. Also, one of the things that had come up was the 60 scoop. So that's something that I had never really heard of. We had some similar things, of course, that came on here within the United States. And before I get into asking about what the 60 scoop was, thank you for talking about journalism and things like that. It's hard for me personally, I don't know about the rest of my team, to think of myself as a journalist or anything like that. I just think of myself as a storyteller, and I'm not even really great at telling stories, but I like stories. And for us, I always feel that we're constantly changing how we approach getting the podcast out there, because we were cognizant that not everybody's going to be Native who listens, but they weren't going to be our primary audience. But as Native and Indigenous people, you're going to be an educator no matter what. If you go into any space that is non-Indigenous or non-Native, you're just, you know, and if the subject comes up like, hey, they're Native, and you just are looked at always as some kind of educator, and it always goes back to history, like 100% of the time. And so it's like, we're always used to explaining. So we identified that our audiences would always be both Native and non-Native, but we also wanted our Native people to be involved, to not be afraid to share their stories. So we're always changing our approach to how we're going to reach them. But also we were cognizant that there were other like podcasts out there who were run by Native and Indigenous people. And I felt like we kind of made a consensus that they're not our competition. You know, we're not competing with all these other podcasts, but we want to do is elevate their voices as well, because no matter if we tell the story or they tell the story, it's going to be an important story that needs to be told. We need to be able to support them through that process. So again, they're not a competition. And coming a little bit out of, again, when you were, I was listening to Finding Cleo with my mother. One of the things that you had said in there was about the differences in how weight is carried when you identify yourself as a journalist in the United States. And I was thinking about that. And I had heard some other, if everybody knows, like I'm a Ronan Farrow fan. So, you know, he had talked about it being a constitutionally protected profession, at least in the United States, you know. And I was quickly looking at it. I see that there were some amendments and things like that going on in Canada, where it's like similar to like freedom of press and all that other stuff. And then, we were talking about like, well, when you came to the United States and you saw these disconnects in terms of law enforcement, and I'd actually just listened to like a few history podcasts and some things like that about just the history of law enforcement within the United States. And it's like was meant to be broken up. That was the whole point, is so that things wouldn't go together, because the United States, either the people or the government, were afraid of tyranny. So this development came out of fear, and that was something that was interesting that I was like learning over the week, was like, wow. So a lot of these things, the reason that they're so disconnected is because of the government does have fear of things, and that's something that we could see, like they fear the people essentially. And of course, a lot of the things that happen within the United States in terms of treaties and all that other stuff, sure, it was a lot about colonialism and doing that, but it was also about fear of the potential of what we could be because of the legitimacy of our being here in time immemorial. You know what I mean? Just being always present here. But back to that, finding Cleo was that, the 60s scoop came on. My mother had talked about her own family being under the influence either of a church or boarding school, encouraging her mother to give up children, for the same reasons that Cleo mothers had, which is like, look, you're overwhelmed, you have these children, some aren't listening, some are doing bad in school, let us take some, or let us take all, or, and we'll send them out to families and they'll come back on the holidays or things like that. When, we don't know the extent, which seems to be like the case of Cleo's mother, which is like, you weren't told the extent of what it is you're actually signing or what it is you're actually agreeing to, because that was the whole point, because it's just like, and again, it all feeds back into the colonialist project of either Canada or United States, which is just like, just eliminate the native and eliminate the indigenous people, because nobody has claim to this land and it's all open. But if you could tell us about what the 60s scoop was.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the 60s scoop, it was like a period in Canada that started in the 1960s, but it went on, for at least until the 1980s. And some people, I think, think that a lot of the things that happened in the 60s scoop are still being carried on today in terms of taking Indigenous kids from our families, but yeah, it was when a large number of Indigenous kids were taken away from their families and communities and placed in child welfare in Canada, and a lot of them ended up adopted into white families and non-Indigenous families, and scattered across Canada, North America, and even the world. There's some stories of Indigenous kids ending up in New Zealand and other places like that. And I think that, the Finding Cleo podcast is about one family's experience through the 60s scoop. So, it started when Crystal Semeganis reached out to me to ask if I would be able to help find her sister Cleo. She explained the story to me that she and all of her siblings, so 6 children in total, children of their mother Lillian Semeganis, were taken by child welfare and separated and adopted into white families and scattered across North America. And they had all reconnected as adults, because this happened in the 1970s. But they were still looking for one sibling. They were still looking for Cleo. And so our podcast was kind of documenting our journey to help them find their sister. But in a lot of ways, I would say, like, another like really important journey that we went on is really trying to understand the truth about what happened to them as children as well, and to really help them share their stories about being apprehended, and what their experiences were in the child welfare system, and how that trauma that they all experienced through that has impacted their whole lives. And I think that the what we're trying to do with the podcast is by focusing on Cleo and Crystal and Johnny and their family, to really help people understand the impacts of the thousands of Indigenous families who went through the same thing. And it's devastating. Like, it's such a devastating story to learn about, and it was such a I'm so grateful to, Crystal and Johnny for asking us to help, and then trusting us to help tell their story. And for just being so open and sharing it with not just us, but with everybody. Because I feel like they reached a lot of people through the telling of their story, and and I think that they really created space for empathy and, for their experiences in a way that I think a lot of our stories are not given that space, that people it is work to try to have empathy sometimes. And so it was also, it's an investigative podcast. So the investigation is finding Cleo, but the investigation is also telling the truth about our history and how, what government policies, where's the accountability? Like, that's something that I'm really committed to and focused on in our reporting, is like, who are the people behind these decisions? And so we were able to visit the archives of Saskatchewan, which maybe doesn't sound that exciting, but it was actually a really exciting few days of going through these documents and reading the memos from the child welfare workers, and the way that they talked about the children that they were apprehending, and learning about this program that was called the AIM program, which stood for Adopt Indian and Métis, which was a program that was designed specifically to adopt Indian and Métis children. And they had advertisements in newspapers, and they had commercials with Indigenous kids being advertised for adoption. And we felt like, Lillian, Cleo's mom, saw her kids in the newspaper, and a picture of them, being advertised for adoption. And just, I think that was part of what we did with the Finding Cleo podcast. And I think I'm curious actually, Robin, what that experience was like for you and your mom listening to that together. Cause I found it difficult to report on, and to help tell that story. And I actually I remember telling my family, no pressure to listen to it. Don't feel like you have to listen, because it's such a hard story in some ways. And not that it's a hard story, it's a hard truth. It's a reality that so many families have experience with. And it's a reality that so many families, if it didn't happen to you, similar things may have. And I think that I was worried it would be triggering for a lot of people. And so I remember saying to my family, don't feel like you have any pressure, and saying that we don't need to be educated about this history because we've lived it and we've experienced it. And I think I was really worried about, the impacts of being reminded of that trauma. And I think one of the things that that podcast actually helped me realize was also the healing power of storytelling and story, and seeing Johnny, we were just talking about him, the day that we went to interview him, I remember that evening he posted this photo of himself and talked about how, I can't remember the exact words, but how much lighter he felt sharing some of that story. And he consistently says things about that. And it helped me show, I think, that it can be a healing thing to share stories, but I know it's sometimes hard. And so I'm curious about what your mom and what your experience was listening to that together.
I was worried a bit about her being triggered. She did have a very similar background in her story to kind of what Cleo and her family and her siblings had went through, dealing with family members being alcoholic or being gone for long periods of time, as well as she was raised by her grandmother, much like how Cleo and her siblings were. And she remembers very similar times. And so at times after listening, it was a bit hard for her. But I think just as my own assessment of my own mother, I felt she was okay and ready to listen to it. but if she had been maybe in a different part of her life, maybe not.
Mm.
So this was a good time for her to kind of like reflect into, she really opened up and shared a lot of those experiences she had as a child, as
Mm.
well as her siblings, and just kind of like the separations that had happened there. And just how she's grateful in the end because her and her siblings are very close. So a lot of them they're still very close, and she's always like, she was actually very thankful that, you know, a similar story could have happened to her and her siblings, but it didn't. You know, it came to the resilience of even herself identifying that she fought for her siblings and their rights and at certain times in their life. And so it was kind of empowering for her to listen to as well as, but of course, I think it really did kind of bring up some triggers for her, but I felt she was strong, very strong enough to listen to it. And we listened to it in the car. So like if she had to do any kind of like business or something, like she likes to go to like Rite Aid or something to just buy her monthly supply of whatever she likes to get. So because, you know, obviously we're still in the middle of COVID. And so we spent a lot of times together alone in the car or anything like that, because we want to, you know, keep the interaction with people low. And so most of the times I'd have my daughter or anybody else, but I think, you know, not that COVID was a good thing, but it allowed my mother and I to have that space just in the car, just to travel and listen to this story. I think the last episodes she really got into really well because, you know, it was done very like poetically, or is really like intriguing, and how it was represented, like having the ambient sounds and the music of the time. I think there was like a Bruce Springsteen song being played and stuff like that. You know, she loves Bruce Springsteen, and you know, she started her family back in the 70s, so she remembers where she was and all this stuff. So it was really I'm actually really grateful. Thank you, Connie, for doing that story. It was really great, and it gave us a great time to be with each other. It was a little hard, but I appreciated that time with her.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. Yeah. But what, like, just again with finding Cleo, like I think it was a obviously like a hard reality to document and to learn about for sure, and to you know, as bravely as they share their stories, Johnny and Crystal and April and Mark, you know, it was like those are really, they went through so many things. But what I loved about reporting on that story was also, you know, the reunion that they had, and the way that they had come together, and there was so much beauty and hope and love in that. And you know, we felt like it was so important to also show that, and to really, and now actually there's a film called Birth of a Family that was done by it was done by Tasha Hubbard, who's an incredible First Nations filmmaker from Saskatchewan, but also who was part of the 60 Scoop. She, you know, and it was about another family that was also taken during the 60 Scoop, and they were coming together, and it's an amazing film. I encourage everyone to watch it. I love that film because it is so focused on you know, this family coming together, and it was just such a beautiful film. It was Betty Ann Adam, who's a journalist in Saskatchewan, and her family allowing Tasha to document their reunion. And I think that's also, you know, so much of my work as an investigative journalist is focused on, you know, sharing some of the difficult truths and trying to get accountability around, you know, missing and murdered, or the 60 Scoop, or other things. But I think, you know, it's also so amazing to see all of the other, like the diversity of our experiences, not just the diversity of our nations, like that there is so much love and laughter and strength, and I mean, like laughter, especially in our communities, and that's something that we need to share as well in our stories.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing forward the history. As you know, in our introduction, we talk about the historical connections to missing and murdered Indigenous women it definitely connects to war cry. And my interpretation of war cry is this balance of strength and vulnerability. I published a case study about our first reported case of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls at Yakima, which was in 1855. And the United States response was a 3-year war. Why is that the federal government's response to an act of violence? And this is a question I've asked the FBI and the White House in their listening sessions. And we, in reporting this and researching this and looking at these different historical connections, both in Canada and in the United States, we see patterns. We see how historical policies and acts of violence are connected to present day MMIW, and we definitely see that in your reporting, Connie. And I want to take a moment and let you put on your award-winning, internationally known journalist hat and just, turn it over to you and ask, much like you did just to Robin, do you have a question for me and the others?
Well, I mean, I guess I'm curious about like what you guys like. This is like, I find this difficult work sometimes, and I'm curious about how you all manage that, like in terms of sometimes, it's important to tell difficult stories, but it's also can be hard to do this kind of work. So how do you guys manage that sometimes difficult task of talking with these stories and being immersed in this work, and also taking care of yourselves and your mental health?
I can start since I knew I was going to ask you to ask me a question. Then we'll go Lucy, Patsy, and Robin, if that's okay with the team. Okay. Well, I mean, I guess I'll focus on today. When I had first learned about Jermaine's case, it was from this young boy that was asking me to pay attention. And, when I read the article date of that one, which was the same day of the year that your last podcast episode came out, and it just screamed to me. I mean, it just seemed like, this story wants to be told, focus on Jermaine. I mean, you have such a wide breadth of work that I just kept thinking, what approach and range can I bring forward? And I thought, I'm going to bring forward what this young man who has Yakima lineage asked me to bring forward. For years later, he took that time for his basketball game. And I think for me, and it's important to have a community approach to this. It's important to listen to our youth. Having 3 children, they have a lot of insight and some of it, it's your responsibility to guide. But in our teachings and in our Yakima way, our youth are our teachers. The name that they share with the grandmother and grandchild is interchangeable, but it's only between that set of grandparent, from Allah, for example. So, as a young child, I grew up seeing and hearing this matriarch of our family, being referred to, this food gatherer, looking to her for answers, for advice. And she would then call me the same term. And the issue that I have, and I think a lot of people have with these policies, is forced assimilation, violent assimilation policies, 60s scoop, forced residential schools and boarding schools, is that it tried to remove and destroy that part of our culture in which our youth are our teachers. So for me, I really took a long moment and thought about what that young man was trying to bring forward and how I could, help, ripple that out into community and, using what platform we have to bring that forward. And, so in considering my approach, I consider what the community has asked of me and how I'm aligning my actions to that. And I feel better about it. It is a triggering thing. It is hard to hear the court case and they're sitting there saying there's this 3 years later after they found the guns, then they're going to charge him. And you have all these things come up and you're just like, what, why? And then I had a question for the federal government and there's Connie Walker on the phone with him talking. It helps streamline all of that when you reconnect with what the community is asking. And, for me, that was definitely of that young child that was trying to bring awareness for her case.
Thank you.
Can you repeat the first part of the question? Because I was so caught up in what Emily was sharing. So I know the second part is about mental health and self-care. So what was the first part again?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was just about, the motivation to do this work, and then how you manage it and how you take care of yourself.
So for myself, the motivation to do this work, it's there's my youngest is transgender. And so, when they were, because they go by the pronouns of they, them, theirs. So when they were 15, they couldn't express that to us. And so they actually had attempted suicide. And then, after we worked through some of that, then they came out and shared, identify as non-gender conforming. And so as somebody who was in social work, I had a huge learning curve for myself, and to try to pick up like, okay, these are the things, this is what's going to happen in our family that's going to be different. And really, it took a huge churn when I started to learn about the statistics about LGBTQ, especially being, people of color, knowing that they're more likely at risk to be assaulted, are, violently killed, especially in the United States. And then I couldn't just bear the thought of having that happen to my child, because their life expectancy doesn't really go past 30, here in the United States, if they're trans feminine. And being a true crime podcast listener for a long time, I really appreciated the cases and the individuality focus, of the people and the families. But then I started to think, well, why don't we have anything like that for us? And then starting to hear yours. And what I appreciated about yours so much is that it gave me this ability to step back and really look at things from a systems view, to be able to say, oh, okay, like this wasn't necessarily happening in isolation, or this wasn't solely happening to us. It was a whole thing that was impacting our community and our state, and whatever that looks like. So when I think about that, and how you were talking about earlier, how to make it yours, I feel like that's how we are making it ours, is just using our own voice to be able to do that. So for myself in all this, just aside from, my child and the concerns about them, being able to, be successful in this lifetime, we have a high number of missing and murdered Indigenous people here on our reservation. We don't know what the numbers are for our males or for our children. And that within itself is concerning. The silence that has been going on for many years is concerning. And so I feel like, with my amazing co-hosts, we have this platform to be able to really elevate some of those voices that have, been silenced for so long. As for self-care, this is what I typically like to ask, our guests, but, and I realize sometimes I'm really poor at it. And it is heavy. There's probably like, it's so easy, I feel like, for myself to get lost in that, and really just, throw myself pity parties sometimes. And so sometimes I have to do that, just have some downtime for myself and really kind of just mentally check out for a little bit, or do things with my kids. Like last night we ended up watching an anime together. So it's just those small things, those small efforts that help me get out of my head and away from the heaviness of this subject.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And to be very brief, thank you for that question. I was thinking when you asked the question, that's a Lucy question that she's always asking us.
Patsy? Do you have your mic on, Patsy?
I did.
Okay, it's hard to hear you. I wonder if it's
Get closer then. I'll move my phone. My laptop crashed, so I apologize. Can you hear me now?
a little bit more.
Okay. How about now?
That's a lot better. Thank you.
Okay, I'll just be very brief, Connie. I want to say thank you again for sharing your story with us today. I really appreciate it. So I'm much older than the young ladies that are here, and so I bring to this conversation personal experience with violence and trauma from childhood to where I am today. I live here in White Swan on the Acoma Reservation, and we're more rural, isolated, and a remote community on the reservation. And so, because of that, we're not in a city where you have access to law enforcement, and law enforcement is pretty absent here in our community as well. So, that is an issue. So, I think just the experience of violence and trauma, myself personally and within family, and the fact that, over the years, I've had not only my sister that's been missing, but also family members, women who've been murdered as well.
I'm so
Several of
sorry.
them here on the reservation. And I think you know, what I carry is not only the younger people's trauma and experience, but also being raised by grandparents and being around a lot of elders when I was very young. And so knowing their stories that they shared with me and some more recent elder stories about their own personal experiences, that when they got older, they began sharing those stories. And so I think I'm at that level, but I've started sharing my stories earlier, just because I thought there needed to be voice out there. And so that's what I did. I just began writing, and I love to write. And so I just thought, in terms of the story for my sister, I was going to write about, the positive attributes and character about who she was. And by doing that and putting it on paper, I was able to share it with my sisters. And so they, one of the sisters was able to pick that up. And so now when she shares, she also shares that, but it's just a guide to share. And most of my work is around sharing with the government, with the federal government, with members of Congress, and also with state legislature. But my background is in education, and so I've witnessed firsthand what happens in public education as well with our children, and the dehumanization of our children, much like how I grew up as a young girl on the reservation, and being my grandmother being in a military school and being raised by her, and then myself being in a mission school here in the community of White Swan. And so, carrying all of this, and also recognizing that we have all of these institutions that have really impacted the daily lives of who we are as a people, and so much so that, I'm just witnessing that my elders who provided testimony to the federal government and to state government, and when they were destroying our grave sites and all of that, as a young child, to just witness all of that, there has to be some justice someplace. And I still have that memory, and I'm going to continue to call it out, which I have done, which is important to do for us in terms of, our relationship, not only with one another, but our relationship with the land and the environment of where we're at. And so, what uh, what I do, for self-care is just being able to articulate this is a part of that self-care as well, and to be able to write it. I've been known to write. If someone did something terribly wrong, I'll write it, and I'll slam it on the table. I've seen this when I was for state government. I had to do this because I was being attacked by an education official at the state level, and what I did was just slammed all these books down on on the desk and said, that's it. I'm not going to send this letter back because of the way this letter was sent to me, by a superintendent. And I just left it there for about 2 weeks. I turned around and sent a nice letter back to this individual people.
So it's things like that. You have to be bold to be able to do those kinds of things. And that if that's going to help me, then I do it. So I just want to say thank you for listening to our voices and also sharing your stories.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, Patsy's being very modest. A part of the majority of a lot of the things that we do is definitely steered by Patsy. I don't like if you live on the reservation here in Yakima, you know that if Patsy asks you to do something, you don't say no. So we always do what Patsy says because she's been through so much and she knows a lot. But so Patsy, actually a part of what rejuvenates me sometimes is when I see Patsy like get riled up about things and she's like, down with the man, down with the system. We're like, yes, that's what I love seeing. But it does get much sometimes. Like Lucy, I enjoy listening to true crime, but there are times I do need to put it away. And I think moving back to the Yakima Reservation, living here with my family and my tribe, I've actually really depended on them when I do have harder times. And so that's kind of like what gets me through a lot of it is knowing that I have a support system there. There are pros and cons because I don't know if you believe in astrology, but I don't know, I'm a Sagittarius and we always just want to like go wander away and go like, in general, that's my personality too. I was like, oh, I want to go here now. I want to go live over here and I don't know, move to a different country for a while and then come back. And then, but when I do go places, I'm just drawn back home for the most part. And a lot of it is because if something is bugging me, I feel I do have that system, like my siblings or my friends who I consider siblings, and even the war cry team. Sometimes there are times I just told them it's a bit much right now. I'm sorry. And they've been very supportive and either picking up and things that I wasn't able to get to, or, they're just there just to listen. So I feel that that's kind of been the biggest thing that helps me. The other thing is spending time like with my family, spending time playing games on my phone. So I like to play like Tetris games, listening to podcasts. And so those times when my daughter falls asleep and I can't sleep, that's how I got through listening to Finding Cleo and searching for Jermaine and all those other ones. And I enjoy learning. So learning through those things is kind of like what really gets me through, and learning a lot about history really, I feel like, helps me manage a lot of things because it also helps me frame my experience and frame the experience of others. So again, like I said, listening to Finding Cleo with my mother, that was actually like, even though it was hard, it actually like really opened a lot of doors and things and stories that I had never had heard before from her. And she had learned too. So that's, I think, listening to podcasts and just playing my game and being able to really dive into stories is what's really helped me. Whereas before, I think one of the things I wanted to say, so you brought up Tasha Hubbard, and I'm a big fan, and I wanted to say this, like, as a United States, someone who's from the United States, an American, as I guess would be called, there wasn't a lot of representation in terms of just media in general of Native people or Indigenous people, especially in the Americas. And so I was always like dependent on other entertainment industries. So like that coming out of Canada was kind of one of the biggest things. So I'd heard of Tasha Hubbard because I was like trying to find any kind of like representation that was similar to mine. And so I was just like, oh, Tasha Hubbard. So I was really happy you brought that up. I also lean on other communities, like Latino, Hispanic, Mexican communities, like in terms of cinema, as well as Asian cinema and things like that, of other people who are in the United States and around the world that are Indigenous and have Indigenous type stories. So listening to your podcast was a part of that, definitely. And I think that's also why we decided to come together, because while we do have some other Native podcasts, I think there's just still not enough. So there needs to be more.
Yeah. Well, thank you all so much. I really appreciate hearing about, what motivates you guys to do the work that you're doing. And also, like a lot of what you all said resonated with me, just in terms of, what and why I want to do this work. And I agree with you, Patsy, that even like talking feels like and sharing also, I feel like is a really big part of taking care of yourself. And so thank you all for making space for me to share today. And I really appreciate it. It's been so great to be here with you.
Thank you so much for joining us today on the War Cry podcast. We do want to give a few war cries out. The family of Jermaine Charlo, her grandmother, Vicky Marshall, and Aunt Valinda, the Hustle Your Bustle basketball team, especially Triance Matt, the young gentleman who in 2019 asked his team to bring forward Jermaine's name. We also have a couple of community announcements. In delay in process, there is a delay when there's a federal investigation of the return of the individuals that have been murdered. And sometimes that's 1-2 years. And we have heard from community members that there are going to be their relatives returning home. So we want to give a war cry to Liz Hildebrand. She will be in Washington soon to take her son home to California. We also want to give a war cry to Sissy Reyes, Chris, and the family of Rosenda Strong, as they are now able to have their ceremony for their sister, I believe in Umatilla, where she's enrolled. She's also a Yakima descendant. Again, for outros, we are an Indigenous-led podcast surviving under the duress of colonization and intergenerational trauma towards self-determination. I'm Emily Washings, and thank you to co-hosts Robin, Lucy, and Patsy. Thank you again to our guest, Connie Walker. For credits, we have support from Native Women in Action. We are edited and produced by Robin Peebushy. Logo and shirts by John Onley Schellenberger with Native Anthro, where you can also get the merch. And music by Lee. Yeah. Robin gave a point out to the shirt there. There you go. And music